Tyre pressure, how important is it really? Today, we're going to look at the effect of tyre pressure because this is massively important and is something that most cyclists get wrong, even some pros. The Pirelli engineers have previously told me that a cheap tyre at the optimum pressure is faster than an expensive tyre at the wrong pressure. So how much does the wrong pressure slow you down? And how much pressure are we talking? And should you vary your pressure depending upon the surface that you ride on? Well, we're at the Silverstone Sports Engineering Hub, where we've been given exclusive access to their state-of-the-art new pedalling efficiency rig, which they reckon can answer those questions and tell us more. Can't wait for this one. Before we crack on, to be able to do stuff like this and get access to facilities like this, we really do rely on your support, more so than ever now that we're independent. So if you like this kind of scientific content where we go all nerdy and deep dive into things, then please do subscribe if you haven't already. Really appreciate it. So they have a new rig here at Silverstone which will allow us, and potentially you, as it's open to the public, test all sorts of things to do with energy losses in cycling. A bit more on that and how it works in a bit. But first, let me tell you what we're going to test. So one of the first things the rig can do is measure the rolling resistance effect of different surfaces. And to do this, it has a big drum which can be interchanged and you can actually ride on top of that, and it has different surfaces on that drum. So today that's going to allow us to very quickly look at the effect of cobbles and also asphalt or tarmac. And that asphalt and cobbles, it was actually built and made for that drum to replicate the Paris Olympic course. So there were Olympians who were optimizing their setup using this system. And the results of what we found have absolutely blown my mind, because if you get your pressure wrong on a given surface, that can be way more difference in terms of the watts it's costing you than a 10 grand superbike that you might have bought. So the things that we were looking at were an expensive tyre versus a cheap tyre on a range of different pressures and different surfaces, but we also had some tyres of different width as well. This is basically the most sophisticated turbo trainer I've ever ridden. So we've just done our fast tyre, and now we're just changing the pressure and lowering it. That was at 7 bar, which is a lot. It's effectively overinflated. So now repeat it, there's 6 bar. So we've just gone down from 7 to 6 bar, and on this surface, it feels so much smoother. It feels so much faster, and I can see my power's lower. Science works, kids. While I crack on with some testing, let me just tell you a bit about this rig, because it's the only one of its kind in the world, and it's really, really cool. So the way that this jig works is it measures the total system efficiency of me, the bike, and everything going on. And then by changing one variable at a time, in this case, we're going to be changing the pressure in the tyres, or we're also, in subsequent tests, going to look at changing chains. You can measure the difference that just that one variable makes. So you're not directly measuring the rolling resistance of the tyres, or say the efficiency of your chain lubricant, but because this system is so sensitive, it can measure the difference of that one variable in the total system efficiency and therefore give you a value. Now, the way it can do that is because this isn't your standard power meter that you'd buy off Wiggle. This is, lab grade equipment. So to put that into context, a standard commercially available power meter you fit to your bike, they typically measure at a sample rate of 1 hertz per second, which is then fed to your head unit. Whereas this is doing 100 hertz. So it's a much higher data resolution, it's much more sensitive, and as a result you can just get much more precise data and measurement. Other things that are going on, the whole system weight is measured. This little gizmo on the back here, that's an infrared sensor that's constantly monitoring and measuring the tyre temperature so that that is kept constant, which is crucial in when you're looking at rolling resistance of tyres. As tyres warm up, their efficiency changes, usually for the better. So this huge drum we've got on here is really cool because it's actually been designed primarily for the Paris Olympics on the outdoor road circuits. We've got 3 different surfaces on there to represent different surfaces on that course. So different types of cobbled surface, and also the typical tarmac you get in Paris, which is, well, it's not as good as the sort of finest Swiss tarmac, but it's all right. And then the other cool thing is this can be swapped out, this drum, for other surfaces. So you can put Siberian pine, well, it's not Siberian pine, there's a problem getting that these days, but you can put a velodrome pine surface down on here, simulate that, and other types of road surface. And it's cleverly set up so that you've got the tarmac down the middle and then different cobbles either side, and the jig can just be moved across, so you can very quickly test on different surfaces. Clever. But overall, this is just so cool. You can measure so many different things. And another absolutely fascinating element of this is Gary, who's helping us perform the testing today. When he sat on the bike to set it up with an exact same setup as me, his efficiency was different to mine. And so it shows you that you need to keep the sort of rider constant as well, because different riders have different efficiencies. And so you can effectively measure your pedaling efficiency and the efficiency as your body as a system as well, which just makes me think, oh, there's a lot of exciting possibilities you could do with this. So now we've dropped the pressure to 5 bar. I'm doing it at a test speed of 35 kilometers an hour, which is about 190 watts, although that changes depending on what we change. So now what we're going to do, having done it on the tarmac, we're going to move on to the most severe cobbles, because we want to see how that affects the pressure that you run and the rolling resistance. So we'll find out how much more power you need to produce on the cobbles, but also what is a better pressure to run on the cobbles. So we're going to start out at 4 bar, which is quite low, and go lower and see if we can find out what's an optimum for that, because, well, many of you like to go and ride on the cobbles and do events like the Flanders or Roubaix Sportives, and yeah, let's find out. Oh, so now on the cobbles, the most severe cobbles, I might add. Oh God, and I'm at 4 bar, which is, well, too much for the cobbles apparently. I've got to get it up to 35k an hour and then we can go. Oh my goodness, this is ridiculous. It feels like a trough. It feels like the Arenberg Trench. The added power that I'm having to put out here is ridiculous. Oh, this is horrendous. It's like about 60 more watts that I need to produce. It's ridiculous to go the same speed. And like the vibrations, feeling them through your muscles is crazy. That is... That's horrible. Oh. So the interesting thing there is that going down to 2 bar, I didn't feel like I was bottoming out on the tyre, and that's a consideration as well. You go too low, you're going to get pinch flats, and you're going to damage the sidewall of the tyre. That felt all right on the cobbles, and we can see, looking at it, side on, which is another beautiful thing you can do with this, you can see that the tyre is sort of structurally okay down at that pressure. However, if we were to go lower, the guys have told me, having used this rig and tested it, that a 28 going down lower than that, you are going to start to bottom out the tyre onto the rim, which you don't want. So we're not going to do that. But it also shows you the width of the tyre being so important. And now we see, pros using 30, 32s as routine. And that's because you can run a lower pressure than that and not bottom out the tyre so much. So there's that to consider. A 25 would be bottoming out at 2 bar. And the other thing that then also you need to factor in is that the whole race isn't cobbles, and that's the same at the Paris Olympics, it's the same at Paris-Roubaix. There are tarmac sectors, so you want to balance that, having the good pressure for the cobbles, but not running it so low that you really lose out on the tarmac sections. So having tested the top-of-the-range Pirelli RS, we're now going to test our Amazon special, the Finchy Defender. Anyway, this thing, if this is faster and has lower rolling resistance and is more efficient than this, then, I don't know what we're going to do. It's just going to shatter my entire belief systems. I'll put them on my bike and ride them in my next time trial. So an important thing to point out, so you know that we're not cheating, we're using the same TPU Pirelli inner tubes in both the tyres. We're not like putting slow inner tubes in and then putting like latex ones in, another one to make it faster. And also something else I've noticed is that these tyres do have a rather nice sort of little silver reflective strip on the sidewall. It's very smart, like a pinstripe. Right, there go ride. That is horrendous. That is awful. So this is lower pressure now. Oh, it's so much nicer. And it's still horrible, but it's nicer. 4 bar, I wouldn't complete Paris-Roubaix on 4 bar. I don't know how they used to do it on 23mm tyres back in the day. That's absolutely nuts. It's not started well for our cheap tyre, but let's see if we can get it to swing the other way with the optimum pressure. 6 bar cheap tyre. This is 5 bar in the cheap tyre. So I've got the results. Firstly, we're going to look at the tyres on just a good tarmac surface. Now, both of them were 28mm tyres, and we did a pressure sweep to work out how much difference pressure makes. So, running at 7 bar, I'm doing that because it's scientific and it's metric, but it's about 101 psi, all the tyres were slower. Now, we went 7 bar, 6 bar, 5 bar, 4 bar. We'll put this on screen so that you can see it. And we basically found that both the fast tyre and the slow tyre were optimal at 5 bar for me, which was very interesting because if I went on the Silka tyre pressure calculator, it would come out for me at 5 bar based upon my weight and the type of speed that we were testing at, which was 35 kilometres an hour. So 5 bar is about 72 psi. Really interesting. Now, in terms of if the fast tyre at the wrong pressure was slower or faster, it was still faster. So the power loss that we got from the fast tyre at the wrong pressure was 23.7 watts, whereas the slow tyre at the optimum pressure was 39.3 watts. So it's almost twice as slow. Like it's that classic thing that, if you're going to bang for your buck upgrade something on your bike, tyres make the biggest difference. So just to be clear, that was the brand new Pirelli P0 RS and a cheapo tyre that we got off Amazon. Now, when we went onto cobbles, it got a lot more interesting. And this is really important because while you might not be riding on cobbles all the time, it also is similar to rough road surfaces, of which, if you live in a country like England, you encounter a lot. Or you might be riding on gravel or off-road, which is a rough road surface. Now, in that instance, pressure became far, far, far more important. So when we ran 4 bar on the rough cobbles, that's only 58 psi. That was really, really inefficient, even in the premium tyre. So we were losing 95.9 watts, which is massive, and that's why riding on the cobbles is so hard. But when we dropped that to 2 bar, which sounds like, it's like really low pressure, like 30 psi, that power loss dropped dramatically to 74 watts. So you've 20 watts. It's massive. Like, so much. Like, that is, in a race situation, that's loads. But it wasn't just the power loss there. It wasn't just the power saving, sorry. The other thing was that the comfort was just noticeably way better. Riding at 4 bar on that rough surface, it's amazing being able to ride that. And you wouldn't get this if you were testing on a normal traditional drum. You don't have that rider input. And if I tried to ride something like Paris-Roubaix at 4 bar, it would shake me to bits and I would just feel horrendous. Whereas dropping the pressure a lot lower, it felt a lot more sustainable. And the intriguing thing about that is that, having spoken to pros and classic specialists I know, that is a lower pressure than what they would tend to run. They told me that they would run more like 3 bar, which is 81 watt loss. And I think that's because they worry about getting punctures. But one of the amazing things we could see was that on these cobbles, 2 bar was not bottoming out the tyre, which, yeah, so maybe there's a gain for pros to run even lower pressures, something which you could do if you ran an even wider tyre. As I say, these were only 28s. If you ran a 32 tyre on a cobbled race or an off-road race, maybe this is the reason why wider tyres are so much better in those situations. But what really blew my mind was the slow tyre. So when we put the slow tyre on the rough surface, we found that when the slow tyre was at that optimum 2 bar pressure, it performed better than the premium tyre, which was amazing. But it was also in line with what Pirelli believed as well. So it's a 78.8 watt loss, and the fast tyre at the wrong pressure, 4 bar, was a 95.9 watt loss. So, yeah, if you're riding on rough surfaces, tyre pressure, even more important. What we can do, though, is put a full table of these results up on the screen, and you can just pause the video and replay it if you want to look at them in more detail. But it really is fascinating. So the other thing that we're able to look at while we were there was tyre width. Now, with any kind of research that you do and any kind of testing, one of the things, if you've ever done it, is that you immediately realise that when you answer some questions, it always invariably leads to more questions. And I just really want you to know that we were limited in the amount of time that we had and the things that we were able to test. And so if you're currently squirreling away in the comments going, why didn't you test this or why didn't you test that? It's probably because we were limited on time, and it is something that we'd like to do in the future. But what I did manage to do is get a 28 and a 30 and a 32 on the rig. Now, rather than test all of these at the same pressure, I didn't have time to do pressure sweeps on all of them, I chose to give each one of those tyres their optimum recommended pressure based on the Silca tyre calculator. So the 4S Pirelli that I used for these is an all-season tyre. So running it at a 28, that was interesting because, well, running it at 5 bar, which that's 72 psi, it was quite a bit slower than the RS Speedy Boy racing tyre. So it was about 17 watts slower, which I thought was really, really interesting, especially when you consider that, well, that's the intention. It's more puncture protection, it's all-season grip, but it's a bit slower. But yeah, quite a lot. Again, performance tyres really can just make you so much faster. So then we switched to a 30mm tyre, which I ran at 4.4 bar, and that was about a watt slower. And then when we switched to a 32mm tyre, run at 4 bar, that was about another watt slower again. So what's interesting here is that a lot of the time we see people and rolling resistance drum testing suggesting that the wider the tyre, the kind of faster it gets. But this is counter to that. When you measure it as an entire system with a rider on there at a pressure that you would actually want to use in real life for a combination of comfort and grip, it actually becomes the case that the wider tyres are a little bit slower. But maybe the sweet spot is that sort of 28mm area. As I said, it would have been nice to have done things like test a 25 or a 23 and see what the situation is there. But we didn't have time. The other thing to point out is that with running the wider tyre and slightly lower pressures, there are potentially other big gains to be had there in terms of, as I mentioned when riding on the cobbles, the comfort aspect that you could experience on this jig was massive to be able to actually, you're testing that, what you feel as a rider, but also things like grip as well in the corners, which is huge. And anyone that watched the wet triathlon at the Olympics, where a lot of the female athletes were sliding off all over the place, well, that tells you everything you need to know. So this kind of testing isn't designed to replace rolling resistance drums. It's not quite as high, I'd say, in its resolution as some other systems because there are more variables introduced and more sources of error with the rider and things like that. But the way to look at it is, say, for example, with aero testing. You have aero testing where people ride around a velodrome with a sensor on, you have wind tunnels, and you have computational fluid dynamic studies. Now, what these different techniques all do is allow you to analyse the aerodynamics of a rider or a bike, but they all complement each other. They all have relative advantages and disadvantages, but they all bring another piece of information to the table. And the more information that you can gather, the better the picture that you can build. And that's what this is. It's just another piece of information, another piece of the puzzle that you can apply that can give you a great understanding of what's going on with the efficiency of a bike or the tyres in this case, and how that works within that whole system. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And the most interesting thing for me is what we mentioned earlier with regards to how when we ran that really low pressure 2 bar, that was amazing on the cobbles. It really did smooth them out. And it makes me want to actually go test that on the cobbles in the future, because I think that there could be a situation where a lot of pro riders could get a massive gain in the cobbled classics and they might be running pressures that are a bit too high. Well, if you'd like to see that, let us know in the comments. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And I hope you found this video interesting. I'm going to go now. Bye.